I'm David Maneri. Thanks for joining us for another story from It Happened in Cambridge. I'm here at Mount View Cemetery in Cambridge, Galt, and we're looking at another fascinating story that happened in Cambridge. It's about a man named George Pringle. The story about George Pringle and how he came to Galt, Cambridge, back in the 19th century is fascinating, as is the story about some of his children. He had 10 children altogether, he and his wife. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, early in the 19th century, and he and his twin brother ran away from home when they were 17 years old. Their mother had died when they were 14. They loved their mother. She was a beloved mother. She was beautiful in appearance and temperament. And the boys truly adored her. When she died, they were heartbroken, as was their father, who they loved dearly. And a few years later, their father remarried. Now, the stepmother was a stepmother, but she treated the boys very well. As they admitted, they said that she was very kind to them and all that. But they felt some sense of adolescent obligation to run away and not to live with this stepmother, and a sense of loyalty to their departed mother, as they said, which was not really a valid reason to run away, and they regretted it. They did run away from Edinburgh, though, and they went to London, England, and in London they joined the army, but they used not the Pringle name. They used their mother's maiden name so that their father wouldn't be able to track them down. It took the father over a year to finally find the boys. The boys had been shipped out to Canada, to the colonies, with the army, with the British Army, and they were in Halifax when the father finally got hold of them, or was able to reach them. And the father sent a letter with some money in it, enough money to buy their discharge from the army and to ship them back home on a sailing vessel. The commanding officer pulled the boys into his office and told them that he had enough money, and explained the letter and so forth. It really moved the boys, but by that time they'd made their decision and they were willing to live with it. At least they thought they were. Again, this sense of obligation to their departed mother was very strong, and they weren't going to give in, and they didn't. And so the money went back to their father in Edinburgh. They never saw their father again, and they regretted that decision for the rest of their lives. It's a sad story, really. In 1840, they joined the Canadian Rifle Division, which was a newly formed unit made up of British officers and recruits, but it was a Canadian. He was registered with the British Army under his mother's maiden name. So that's the name that he used with the Canadian Army. It wasn't his real name, Pringle. He served out a number of years with the Canadian Army and retired, and came to Galt with his young family and raised 10 children here. But the pension check he got every month was in the name of his mother's maiden name, and he was fully entitled to it. It was just a different name. His young son, George Pringle, used to see that letter come in once a month addressed to another name, and yet he saw his father open it month after month. And when the boy was old enough, he asked his father about it, and the father told him the whole story and told him about running away and how he had used his mother's maiden name, and that yes, he was entitled to that money and that pension, he'd earned it, but that was the story behind that other name. George Pringle, and his grave is right behind me here. If I turn around, you can see it over my shoulder. I used to see this grave as a kid. I'd come into Mount View Cemetery, and we used to have a chestnut tree here where we would harvest chestnuts. and play a game that we called chestnuts. The British call it conkers. A lot of fun. They don't play it anymore in these parts. I'm not sure if it's played elsewhere in schoolyards. It should be a fun game, simple game, but the magic of getting a pristine chestnut and cracking open the shell on a fall day, and we'd get baskets full of these chestnuts so that we had a good armament to enter the fall season, the chestnut season. Anyway, coming through Mount View Cemetery, I noticed this Pringle grave. It's that Pringle name is very prominent. You see it on that gravestone, and right around, the reason I remembered that name was because the Pringles potato chips were just coming into vogue in the 60s, I think, at that time. And so I used to make a connection between those potato chips and this Pringle grave. And I always wondered, I wonder if there's a connection between the two. Of course, there isn't, at least not that I know of. And but later on, when I got interested in history and I started researching a fellow by the name of Pringle, who was a Presbyterian minister. He was an author. He'd written several books, and I got one of his books. He was from Galt. Went to the University of Toronto. He grew up on Wellington, what is Wellington Street. It used to be called Queen Street at the time. And he was a talented student. He went to Tassie School before he went to the University of Toronto. He could have gone into any field that he wanted. He chose the ministry. His father had brought him up in the church, in the Presbyterian church. They all went to Knox Presbyterian Church. George Sr., who lies behind me here, was an elder at that church. A few of his children became ministers. Others became missionaries, going to such far-flung places in the 19th century as India and China. And his namesake, George Jr., George Jr. went out to the Klondike to be with his brother, who was also a Presbyterian minister out in the Klondike, during the gold rush days, right around the turn of the 20th century. And in one of the books that he wrote, he told this story about his father and changing his name, running away from home and all that, and a very poignant story that I remembered. And I was thrilled to make the connection between that George who wrote the book, George Jr., and this George Sr. However, there was one thing that, and this, we'll have to go into more detail about the Pringle children, because they've got some fascinating stories, as you can imagine, being out in the Klondike during the gold rush days, and the other one was a minister there. A third son, the eldest son, was a NorthWest Mounted Policeman, and so we've got some future stories to tell regarding those people, and so stay tuned, we'll bring those to you. But the thing that troubled me about this gravestone was that when I looked at it, his was the only name on this stone. There were no other names, none of his children, not his wife, and it didn't make sense to me until I learned that when he died in 1901, he was in his 82nd year, his wife was still living. His wife was a native of Prince Edward Island. He had met her when he came to Canada, and they got married early on. So rather than stay here in Galt, all her children had departed mostly, and several of them were living out in British Columbia, and a couple of his sons, her sons, were out there, the ministers, but also the Mountie, and she had at least one daughter, maybe a couple, that were nurses up in the Klondike and out in British Columbia. So she packed up after her husband died and went out to British Columbia, where she lived out the remainder of her life and where she died. And she's buried, it's interesting, she's buried at Mountain View Cemetery. Mountain View is the same cemetery, I think, where Noah Brusso, the former world heavyweight champion, who won the heavyweight championship as Tommy Burns, is buried. But in any case, she's buried at Mountain View Cemetery. Her husband, George, who preceded her here behind me, is at Mount View Cemetery. So very similar names, but thousands of kilometers apart. In any case, that's an abbreviated version of the story of George Pringle Sr. And please stay tuned for George Pringle Jr., who I've done a lot of research on over the years. And I can't wait to tell you the story about him as well. Thank you for joining us for this story on It Happened in Cambridge.